Good morning. I'm from South Georgia, grandson of a Baptist preacher. Good morning. All right, all right. First of all, thank you, Scott, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to say special thanks to CJ, John, and Victoria, and the board of Grow Smart for your hospitality yesterday. Oh, perfect. You know, just a little bit. I just want to say thank you again to the staff. You guys have been great. Your hospitality has been truly touching. But I have to say, I'm really glad to be back in Providence. I was here almost a year, almost to the date here, and it was my first time in Providence besides flying to another location in Maine as a pit stop, where I actually got to check out and experience Providence. And it reminded me of a number of communities across the country where I visited, where you saw this vibrant nature of young people, baby boomers enjoying downtown living. And I have to say, now coming back the second time, I actually am kind of confused. I'm like, what happened to the city I saw last year? So many new restaurants are opening up, new maker spaces. And so that gives me a lot of encouragement that this thing that we talk about, walkable urbanism, is spreading and is growing. I think we're seeing here, just looking across many of the streets that I visited last year, new stores coming in, new pop-up restaurants. It's really exciting. Scott, you did me justice in introducing my organization. Scott is also my board member, so I have to be here. So I'm really glad that he extended an invitation again. I had to say this. I was in the office on Tuesday. Scott was on the phone with our new president and CEO of Smart Growth America, Calvin. And I guess in the midst of that conversation, Scott sent to Calvin the poster that Christopher Coes is going to be in Rhode Island. And then my boss said, "You're going to Rhode Island. You're going to kick rock this thing." And I'm like, yes, I know. I have to do that for Scott. I know that already. So I said again, I'm really excited to be in Providence. I'm really excited to do whatever I can to support the efforts that, Scott, you and your team are doing. Now with that, I just want to kind of orient ourselves today. As Scott pointed out, I want to cover about 4 major topics. First and foremost, I want to kind of make some observation of what we're seeing across the country in the TOD market. Secondly, I will like to kind of give you some insights on some of the latest best practices, particularly as it pertains to public-private partnerships, as well as some of the federal policies that are impacting and shaping transit-oriented development today. And then last, I would also like to highlight some observations. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to talk to a smaller group about some of the macro issues that are facing transit-oriented development, but actually more importantly, what the smart growth movement is actually going to be in the future is based on decisions that we're going to make today. And so I'll end on some observations of some of the things that I hope you would take back to your respected communities, offices. And actually with that, you know who I am based on Scott's introduction, but I would just love, by a show of hands, how many elected officials are in the room? Okay, got one, elected official, one. Any planners or city officials or officials from the state? Okay, great. Nonprofit advocates. Okay, my favorite folks, only because I work with you guys every day, the private sector. Okay, great, great. How many of you are developers or investors? All right, got one, awesome. If I miss anyone, just shout it out really quickly. Oh. Labor, oh, actually I have a whole segment for you. That's great. So again, I think the most important element about this conversation is that it's going to take all of us to do transit-oriented development well. Now with that, a quick background. For those of you who don't know, LOCUST is Latin for place. And it's a national network of real estate developers who specialize in walkable urbanism across the country. Some of our members include Forest City, JBG, some of the largest historic redevelopment, HRI, based in New Orleans, some of the largest affordable housing developers like McCormick, Bell, and Salazar. But one of the things that you should know about this network of 300 real estate development companies and investors, we actually all subscribe to one simple principle, and it's called triple bottom line. While it is true that TOD may be profitable in a lot of communities, it's also important as a development community that we also promote equitable development, that we care about people, and lastly, that TOD or walkable urbanism actually is going to support climate change and addressing that issue. So I say that to say I work with good guys, not the bad guys. With that, I always wanted to orient myself, why are we having this conversation around TOD? And I know all of us, I believe, support these principles, but we know the reason why TOD is so critical to the future of our country, the future of our communities, and the future of just ourselves is the fact that it brings so many positive attributes that touches on a whole range of issues, whether it's reducing household income, transportation costs, and also making housing more affordable, whether it's providing better access. And I know I had a conversation to a gentleman who's in the health space, the idea that we know that places, particularly transit-oriented development, provide healthier communities. The fact that if you really care about climate change and climate economic resiliency, that TOD is one of the top strategies that we have to deploy to ensure that we are prepared for the rising sea levels. And lastly, we are seeing across the country, and like I said, seeing it right here in Providence, the truth of the fact of the matter that TOD is an effective economic and community revitalization. But more importantly, TOD done correctly, done equitably, is a sure win-win for everyone. Now, with that, Scott had on a call a couple of weeks ago, Scott and his team said, Christopher, we want you to give the state of TOD. And I was like, oh, awesome. I'm going to be like the president. I'm going to get on the stage and say the state of TOD is strong. And they said, no, don't do that. Don't do that. So with that, I'm going to do it anyway. So across the country, the state of transit-oriented development is absolutely strong. I think there are a couple of things you should know. Most recently, the National Association of Realtors did a survey, a consumer preference survey, and it found whether baby boomers and millennials, over 60% of Americans favor walkable urban places over drivable suburban. Secondly, we're finding that individuals, the American Public Transportation Association released that now Americans who are near transit access are seeing $10,000 in net savings in their household income. Lastly, we are seeing across the country, in most of the top 30 metros, major investments in transit. And lastly, I think right now we'll be seeing over 366 miles of new transit lines coming on board. I say that to say, these are good days for transit-oriented development. If you're interested, if you're a developer, if you're an advocate, I have to tell you right now, this is one of our best times. And I'll say this. When I started at Locust almost 10 years ago, and prior to that as Deputy Director of Transportation for America, transit-oriented development in many communities across the country was a four-letter word. I can tell you now, it is still a four-letter word, but it's in one of the ways like, yeah, we can actually do something here. That is the good news. There are some challenges. Increasingly, we're finding that transit-oriented development and the walkable urban development space has a unique problem, and that we all know, affordability, particularly around housing. But here's something you need to know now. In addition to the crisis that we're seeing for affordable housing, and I like to use the term attainable housing because everyone needs to have housing in walkable places, not just rich people, not just poor people, but also the middle class. But also we're finding increasingly that there is a major challenge for affordable commercial spaces. And I think when we talk about affordability, we have to broaden it not just from the housing discussion, residential, but also the fact that a lot of our mom and pop stores that are in these spaces are actually being displaced as well. In addition to that, there are some major headwinds right now in the TOD space. For number one, despite the fact that we have increased consumer demand both from baby boomers and millennials, it is actually exacerbating land prices across the country. Secondly, we're also finding that many developers are saying, you know what, a lot of communities are implementing new regulatory barriers, increasing costs of construction. In addition to that, you may have noticed recently, just as of today, the administration is being very aggressive on tariffs, which I think today we're now doing about a $15 billion tariff charge on China. We just did one last week on Canada and Mexico, which is impacting the steel market. We're beginning to find that this, coupled with our labor issues, the fact that this is actually driving up the cost of TOD, not just in a lot of the major markets, but we're seeing this across the board. One of the things I did not highlight here, but I think is very pertinent here in Rhode Island, is that quietly, and we'll see more news about this over the coming months, but one quiet driver of cost for TOD is climate. Just last week, New York Times released an analysis of Florida, where specifically in the Miami-Dade County area, communities that are in low-lying areas were seeing higher costs, lower costs compared to those that are in higher elevation, meaning we call it now climate gentrification. If you are a building that's less likely to have impacts on climate change, you're seeing higher land costs. I think that is something that you're going to see here in Providence. But also, I think Scott and I had this conversation yesterday, that's also an opportunity for a place like Providence compared to other communities like Boston or Manhattan, where the cost for those walkable urban places to retrofit themselves and prepare for the rising sea levels may be much higher than, say, for Providence. And that puts you in a strategic advantage. So these are some of the headwinds that we're seeing across the country that I think you should be mindful as you're thinking about the policies, how you deploy your transportation infrastructure, as well as thinking about how to deal with affordability on housing and commercial spaces. Here's something that I think you should be firmly aware of. Across the country, about between 2010 up to 2015, the top 10 markets across the country were seeing massive population integration. However, since 2015, we have seen in DC, in New York, in San Francisco, a leveling, a plateau, in some places, actually a decline in population migration. And in many cases, we're seeing that in the real estate market, a lot of the members I'm working with are not saying, can I invest in DC? Should I go to Boston? They're saying, you know what? I want to go to Raleigh. I want to go to Nashville. I want to go to Denver, Philly, the secondary markets, for a number of reasons. One, the top 10 markets are priced out. Two, many of the secondary markets are close to major regional hubs and have put in new transit systems. And so for a place like Providence that is on this list, you have an essential opportunity to take advantage. Developers are looking for the next community that is close to major urban areas but connected by transit or commuter rail. And guess what? Providence has a lot of that. Rhode Island has a lot of that. And so you are a community that I think and I know that a lot of my developers are looking into right now. So with that, what are some of the top programs, best practices, strategies that developers, communities are using to amplify equitable transit urban development across the country? Well, I'm going to name a couple. First, value capture. By a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the concept value capture? Okay? For those who are not, it's a very simple concept. We all know that if you put transit near development or you create TOD, the land value increases, right? The idea is very simple. Oftentimes, that value that is created goes to the private sector. Is there a way for the public sector to capture a portion of that value creation and bring it back to public use? And in many cases, back to transit. This is a very popular strategy that we're seeing across the country being deployed. Now, this can be done in a number of different ways, depending on the type of incentives and rules that you have in your state. For example, in Kansas City, they just about 2 years ago completed a 10-mile streetcar line that is now a horizontal sales tax district. So any sales tax that's generated, the increment, now will go to support their streetcar line. In Chicago, just recently, just 2 years ago, they decided to modify their existing TIF district, which is basically tax increment financing districts, where now any property revenue along their red line that goes out into the suburban community, those revenues not only can support transit, but also that value that is captured will support affordable housing. So these are two popular strategies that we're seeing across the country on how people are trying to find new revenue streams to support transit, but also affordable housing and other public infrastructure. Key elements that you need to know to make value capture a huge success. Number one, you have to do the planning up front. And the planning cannot just be the transit team and the planning folks talking to each other. No, it has to be a full cross-section stakeholder conversation that includes the public, private, and the general public as well. Second, one of the biggest complaints that my members have when we talk about transit or in development is that too often when the transit line comes in, the local municipalities have not aligned their local zoning and regulatory structure to actually make TOD, infill development, actually legal. So I ask you a simple question, by a show of hands. How many do you believe that in Rhode Island or in all its local jurisdictions have aligned their local TOD zoning policies to promote this? By a show of hands. So number one, we got to fix that. If you are trying to attract private investment, the first thing they're going to do is check your zoning regulatory and ask around, how long does it take to get an approval? What are some of the other barriers there? So I said that said. The last thing is, this is something that we're noticing a lot of communities who are interested in the conversation around TOD, and it's the fact that sometimes they go too big, and they create a transit line that goes to nowhere, and they hope that it creates an urban community. I'm telling you right now, the number one strategy to create successful TODs is to connect places that already exist. Connect to what is real. Do not try to create your own like instant urbania community. It doesn't work. It costs too much money, and trust me, no one's coming. So with that, the second observation that we're seeing across the country is this new incentive about opportunity zones. By a show of hands, how many people are familiar with this program? Oh, perfect. Okay, good, good, good. Well, this program is very simple. This is a new federal tax program that was created in the recent tax legislation, which many people say it was good and bad. I'm going to focus on the good parts right now. One of the key elements that has happened is that governors across the state, and just yesterday we were able to finalize the last 4 states, where governors were allowed to identify low-income census tracts that can now receive unrealized capital gains, which is on right now about $6 trillion of private capital to invest in those communities. Now with that, we just recently, and just so you know, if you go to locustdevelopers.org, we have what is called an Opportunity Zone Navigator, where you can actually type in your address and see if you're in a opportunity zone, if you're in a transit district where you're within a quarter mile of a transit station, if you have brownfields, as well as other economic and housing data to kind of give you a better understanding of how you may do certain place-based strategies or private sector investment thought process. However, one of the things that we've learned through the analysis of all of the 7,000+ zones that have been created, census tracts have been designated, about 30 million Americans are having about a poverty rate about 35 and higher, 30% poverty rate. And about 8.5% of those census tracts and those opportunity zones actually have transit in them. Now, with that being said, for Rhode Island, this is an opportunity that you cannot ignore. Right now, you have about 9 transit projects, BRT, high-frequency bus, passenger rail, that are in or adjacent to an opportunity zone. And I'll say here, in downtown Providence, around your intermodal station, this is an absolute opportunity for you to take advantage of this program. Now, you may be saying, well, Christopher, how do we take advantage of this program? Well, I have some thoughts about that. So just to kind of reorient everyone, this program is simple. If you're an individual or a corporation with unrealized capital gains, this program allows you to defer your taxes for a period of time. From 5, 7 to 10 years, you get certain incentives. If you keep it for 5 years, you get a 10% step-up basis. If you keep your money into an opportunity fund for 7 years, you get a 15% step-up basis. But if you keep those dollars in opportunity funds that are investing in distressed communities for over 10 years, any money that you've made on that investment is tax-free. So you can see this is an interesting incentive. However, it also creates an opportunity for you, Rhode Island. imagine if Rhode Island created a opportunity fund that then went out to employers, to their major corporations, to high net worth individuals to invest in. Now that Rhode Island fund could potentially invest in property like real estate, could invest in businesses like mom and pop stores, or could do joint ventures with development companies to do all those projects, activities. Now, here's some things I need you to know. In order to make opportunity zones successful, there's something that you have to be mindful of. This program is not a DC-run program. So many of us are familiar with the New Markets Tax Program, right? By a show of hands, okay? Well, that program requires, if you want to receive New Markets Tax Credit, you actually have to get pre-certified. This program doesn't require that. It's simply a self-declaration sheet that you send in when you do your taxes. So the federal government doesn't have any control of who does this. However, the state and local governments have the ability to shape the market by saying, this is our strategy for opportunity zones and funds in our state or in our locality. And here are some strategies that we're seeing across the country that people are deploying. One of the things that we're seeing with localities and states is that they're going to create their own state and fund. Oftentimes, those funds may have a specific agenda: housing, business concentration, TOD. Secondly, we are seeing, like in the state of New Jersey, they are creating a whole roundtable of interagencies at the state level, as well as private sector and philanthropy, to talk about how they're going to correlate their investments together to invest in their state funds. Lastly, third, there's a commitment and a conversation about you have to know the investor type. As I said before, this program has 3 layers. It has a 5-year mark, a 7-year mark, and a 10-year mark. And for those of us who are in the industry, in the real estate industry, it's all about the exit strategy. And investors want to know, if they put their money into a fund, how are they going to get out? And the fact that the state and local governments can provide that clarity allows investors that risk profile and risk management on their exit strategy. And last but not least, we're finding cities have to implement do no harm policies now. If you are not sure what a do no harm policy, by show of hands, do you guys know what do no harm means? All right, for those who don't know do no harm, very simply, if you know you're going to do equitable development and revitalization in an economic corridor, particularly around transit, have you put inclusionary housing or affordable housing policies in place? Have you ensured that, particularly if you have a high percentage of your population who are above 55 or elderly, have you put certain property abatement policies where their property taxes don't go up? Are you doing things that you ensure anti-displacement strategies for small businesses and other target populations? Other ideas, advocates right now are considering creating their own funds for affordable housing, talent retention. The private sector is, we're seeing creating their own, in Detroit, there's a developer who is creating a $1 billion project pipeline where they're going to basically take the land to attract investment. Just this week, Kresge and Rockefeller just announced a multi-million-dollar program where any investor or fund manager who's interested in creating equitable opportunity funds could potentially have co-sponsorship by these major foundations. I say that to say the private sector is not going to drive this conversation alone. It's going to require the cities, the state, advocates to participate to ensure that this program that doesn't have any data tracking, that doesn't have any real oversight, to ensure that it actually provides a positive impact on the neighborhoods. The third best practice and strategy that we're seeing across the country really comes in the form of some new federal financing for transit-oriented development. And today, I'm only going to focus on one because there's a sense of urgency. Back in 2015, Locust, working with a number of other advocates on Capitol Hill, was able to create a multi-billion-dollar transit-oriented development fund, particularly in the Rif program. And for those, I know I'm from Washington, D.C., but although I'm from rural Georgia, I hate acronyms. So Rif, for those of you who don't know, stands for Railroad Rehabilitation Improvement Financing. This is a $30 billion fund loan program based in D.C., administered by U.S. DOT, that helps support passenger rail, commuter rail investments. What we were able to accomplish in 2015 was that now transit-oriented development is now eligible. In addition to that, we made TIFIA, which is the Transportation Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act. I know, DC, I don't know why. Which is another similar loan program, but for a whole host of infrastructure that includes not just transit-oriented development, but also highway, ports, BRT. But one of the things that I want you to be mindful of is that the Rif TOD financing expires in a year. So for those of you, you saw that opportunity fund zone for downtown Providence. You had the central TOD location and a number of others. If you're interested in using the Rif financing, which I'll talk about in a second, you have to the end of next year to get those applications in. So let me talk about that program for a second, and you'll see why this is of interest. As I said before, this program provides low-interest loans to localities and to real estate development companies on a range of projects. One of the key elements about this program is low interest. So right now it's like 3.1% over 33 years. You have the ability to scope your payment based on your revenue stream. Also, you have the ability to delay your first loan payment 5 years after completion of the project, which of course for TOD, as you know, takes a long time to actually generate revenue, which makes this program very ideal. But more importantly, the Rif program, if you had a $100 million project here at the intermodal station in Providence, the Rif program would provide you $75 million of that. 25% of it has to come from the private sector or from local government. So you have a program that can provide a major source of funding and financing for really true revitalization. And again, this supports commercial and residential development. Now, some people have asked, is there an affordability requirement? There is not. But we really believe that that's on the local government as well as the transit agency or transportation entity to decide that. On the TIFIA side, and I won't spend too much time on this because this is not set to expire, but this program is much similar to the Rif. And the thing about the Rif program is only for commuter rail and passenger rail, but Rif is for all transportation assets. But one of the things you should know, the difference between TIFIA and Rif, is that TIFIA is only 33% of total financing costs, project costs, while Rif is a much higher threshold. And again, these are some of the elements of the funding you can use for TIFIA, for property acquisition, community services, transit station improvements, and parking decks. One of the things I want to end my presentation on is two final observations. We're seeing technology truly change the real estate industry and the built environment. We're seeing it with rideshare. We're seeing it with BRT as new, flexible, and economical transportation sources. AVs are changing the game. In many ways, ride-sharing is actually allowing a lot of the issues that we had with TOD, which is the last mile. How do you get people from the station to their homes? Fill that gap. Neighborhoods now that were traditionally off the radar map for the private industry are now coming on because, you know what? You can get Uber. You can take it to the train station and get to your jobs or to entertainment. We find this as a benefit, and I said this last night to our small group. These are tools. However, we have to make sure that the tool is not driving us, but that we are actually driving the tool. And if we do not hold ride-sharing like Uber and Lyft, but particularly AVs, autonomous vehicles, to a standard that actually benefits us, we may find ourselves doing the same thing we did when we created the automobile back in the 1950s. And a perfect illustration of this is how many of you are familiar with the, I think it was the World Fair 1945, where GE kind of basically said this is America in the 1970s, 1980s, where basically you walked in and you saw this glorious highway where people were driving past trees, clean air, and had this wonderful home. And it was basically like, don't you want to get away from the noise of the urban community? It was basically the poster child of suburban life. That really created this PR campaign across the country for people to leave the urban core to go out suburbia, and which is one of the reasons why smart growth movement was actually created. Well, I want to show you this recent image from Ford. Now, mind you, a lot of the auto companies have now said in their mission statements that we're not car companies, we're mobility companies. And most recently, Ford kind of did this rollout, much like GE did back in the 40s, of what their vision of the future of America. So you see here, you have some autonomous vehicles, you have park cutouts. We all like that, right? We like the ability for pedestrians to cross the street. There's improved walkability. Look at that high-speed mass transit up there. Do you see what's missing? Place. People. The fact of the matter is, this picture of what Ford believes the new mobility America looks like has an eerie look of what it looked like in 1940. The fact of the matter is, where is the community? Where are people? And unfortunately, this picture is a great depiction of how technology determines the future of place versus people determining the future of place. And I put this out there to say, right now on Capitol Hill, there is a autonomous vehicle legislation being championed by a number of automakers and tech companies that would remove the ability of state and local governments to determine how AVs interact in their communities, which we like to call preemption. In addition to that, the legislation will also prohibit local governments, state governments, and even advocates to get the data behind the AVs. So, for example, you may not know this, but at Smart Growth America, we have what is called the Smart Cities Collaborative, which is about 30 cities who are working together to share best practice on deploying smart technology in their communities, including AVs. Through that work, my colleagues have shared some interesting nuggets that you may find interesting. Number one, you may have realized and seen in the news that there have been a number of accidents with AVs and pedestrians. Most 2 of the 4 were all at night, largely because AV technology doesn't have night vision. Second nugget you may not know. Right now, the best AV on the streets now can, for a single person in the walkway, have a 60% success rate of identifying that that is actually a human being. If you actually put that person on a bike, that actually goes down to 20%. If you have someone who has a stroller, the AV does not have the ability, more than 20% success rate, to determine whether it's a mother with a stroller or a deer. The challenge here is the technology requires us to take the reins and actually decide how it's going to be deployed. Otherwise, you're going to have a scenario where, to solve that problem, we need to make sure there are barriers between the road and the pedestrian. We need to put up pedestrian laws that says you can't walk here. That is not what the smart growth movement is about. The smart growth movement is about creating places for people to thrive. And I'm telling you right now, the AV conversation is by far the 1940 automotive discussion. If we do not address this now, we will be finding ourselves 20, 30 years saying this was our worship moment that we missed. The last thing I would say is really going to the crux of this conversation. There's a lot of excitement around transit-oriented development, but I have to be really honest with you. You cannot have TOD if you do not have the T. And while there are a lot of success stories across the country, we're also finding that there are a lot of bad stories of how our conversation around transit and building support still needs work, and why the work that Grow Smart Rhode Island is so important for this region. And one of the things I'll use is just last month, Nashville did a ballot referendum to do a massive transit build-out. Nashville, much like the statistics I showed before, is a major secondary market that people are driving to. It has culture, it has universities, eds, meds, and they have a massive congestion problem. So of course transit would be the #1 solution. But it failed miserably. Why did it fail? And this is some nuggets that you should take as you think about how to move TOD forward. #1, here's some things that people were saying about the ballot initiative. That it's going to increase your taxes and it's not going to have any impact on the traffic. Secondly, trains and buses never pay for themselves. When we began to pull this back through our Transportation for America campaign, we started talking to the advocates and said, what do you believe went wrong? And here are 2 nuggets that I think I want to leave with you as you think about how do you create new transportation, particularly transit investments in the region. And #1, there was a lack of unified leadership when it came to transit planning. A lot of this conversation was driven by the transit authority. Not just the cities, not the private sector, not the advocates, but it came from one shop. And there was not a unified message. Secondly, because of the lack of unity about the understanding of transit, it was very easy to paint transit as just another hippie idea, but more importantly, the ballot initiative actually saw that amongst the communities who would tremendously benefit, particularly low-end communities, actually they also saw low approval ratings for the transit ballot, partly because they were not part of the conversation and they were hearing that if they build the transit, you will be pushed out. And so one of the challenges I want to leave with you is that Providence has a lot of things going. Rhode Island has a lot of things going. You have the infrastructure. You are adjacent to major markets. You have the opportunity to put in affordable housing strategies now that can ensure that you, on the long term, are not repeating the mistakes. And so in that, Scott said, always give us homework. So what can Rhode Island do? Number one, you have a number of commuter rail and passenger rail Amtrak stations. Apply for TOD financing today. Number two, the governor and the localities who have opportunity zones should convene a task force to make sure that state and local resources are aligned. Here's the thing you need to know. There's over 7,000 census tracts that have been designated opportunity zones. None of them are created equal. The ones that will attract the most investments are the ones where the localities and states have actually a clear strategy and method and reduced barrier to investment. Number three, Rhode Island should create its own affordable TOD fund. Number four, create, and I think this is really your homework, Scott, continue to build a cross-sectional stakeholder coalition for transit, because what we're finding, even in places like New York and DC, it's hard to get new funding to support transit. And if you do not have a cross-sectional support, a mayor who may have been really supportive of transit, a new mayor comes in, a new city council member comes in, that can go away. And you really do need that broad support. And then lastly, and I think I said in this to say about the equitable aspect of this conversation, Rhode Island, you are one of the most equitable places for someone in Boston to live, to commute back and forth. But that will not stay for long, because right now your state does not have an affordable housing strategy to ensure that for the next 30 years, you could still not only have places for low income, not just for places for firefighters and teachers, not just for places for who are rich people, but the fact that for the foreseeable future, Rhode Island will be the most equitable developed state in this country. You don't have a plan, and you need one now before it's too late. With that, I thank you, and I'll take some questions.